In the name of one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. It can be tempting for preachers to take apart each section of today's gospel passage and expound upon them. Each one is enticing and has much to offer by the way of theological reflection. The transition from Jesus' riverside baptism to his wilderness challenge, the identity of Jesus, how we interpret Satan today. It would be interesting sometime to compare and contrast the voice of God calling Jesus the beloved and the voice of Satan calling Jesus to prove himself. But taking on this whole packed passage would be more than we could chew on in just one sermon. So maybe today we could just take up the bread. After fasting in the wilderness for 40 days, Jesus was famished. Satan tempts Jesus to turn the stones at their feet into loaves of bread. Not just to make one loaf to satisfy his own hunger, but multiple loaves. In this way, Jesus could really prove who he was. He'd be a hero, accomplished, powerful. Perhaps he could feed other people as well if he could just turn those rocks into bread. I learned about bread making when I was in college. I had a big, beautiful new bread bowl and started out experimenting with different ratios of white and whole wheat flour. One day, just as I was starting a batch and was feeding honey to the yeast, I got a phone call inviting me to go out with friends. I very much wanted to see them, and so I decided that I was an accomplished enough baker to cut a few corners. Well, the resulting loaves resembled bricks and didn't taste much better. It was then that I learned that time is the most essential ingredient in making bread. You cannot rush the yeast. It has to bubble and activate on its own. And there is no substitute for the cycles of rising and resting the dough. Dough has its own work to do in its own time. There in the wilderness, Jesus discerns that the time and the circumstances are not right for making bread. Quoting Deuteronomy, he tells Satan, "One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." By staying firmly in authentic relationship to God and neighbors, Jesus is able to resist the temptation of power and glory that is held out to him. And when Satan fled, the messengers from God came and ministered to him. Matthew reports that later in his ministry, Jesus fed 5,000 people from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And another time he fed 4,000 from 7 loaves and a few fish. But in those instances, Jesus' disciples share in the miracle. It's the disciples who find the morsels with which to alleviate the hunger around them. It's the disciples who distribute the food that Jesus has blessed. Jesus was tempted to prove himself by acting on his own, to be the superstar, the hero with power and pizzazz. "If you are the Son of God," Satan said to him, "you would do these things." Many thought the promised Messiah would sweep in like a conquering hero, clean house, and rid the promised land from the Roman occupiers. He would bring about justice and restore the people of God to power. The Messiah would take control. But right from the start of his ministry, there in the wilderness, Jesus faced off with Satan. Perhaps today we would say with systemic evil, and not with a thirst for power, but with vulnerability. Jesus taught a different way. He taught us that the wisdom of the world is foolishness to God. He turned the prevailing social order on its head and showed that there is a different kind of strength in being vulnerable. There's a power in being weak, and there can be clarity in staying hungry and uncomfortable for a time. Jesus didn't come to impress or align himself with the rich, but to stand with the marginalized. And by refusing to go it alone, Jesus showed that sharing power and building up others is the wisdom of God's kingdom. The temptations that Jesus faced are common to all of us. We like to be perceived as relevant, competent, and effective in our lives and in our jobs. We judge ourselves and evaluate others by the bottom line, by measurable outcomes and a deliverable product. We want to get things done, to make things happen, and sometimes doing it all by ourselves can seem easier than doing the slow work of cultivating relationships and empowering others to use their gifts. But power and control shouldn't be allowed to take the harder place, the harder task of love. When we find ourselves in a wilderness, in some new and unfamiliar territory of life, we may be tempted to satisfy our cravings with that which is not food, or to fill a gnawing emptiness and discomfort with things that are not life-giving. In Lent, it might be helpful to voluntarily go into the wilderness by ridding ourselves of some distractions and spending time in silence and simplicity. In silence and simplicity, there's room for the voice of the Holy Spirit to bubble up and to activate us. In the desert of silence and simplicity, not much is hidden. There we can find the truth about ourselves. Awareness of our inadequacies may be just the right environment for turning to God and to others. Awareness of something lacking in the systems to which we belong may be the right environment for finding and using our gifts. So I invite you in this holy season of Lent to take some time with the questions. For what am I hungering? What do I desire? Is this of God? Will this bring me closer to the love of God and others? God longs to feed us with Christ's own self. In the midst of whatever wilderness we find ourselves, God sets a table right there for us. In God's presence, we can find what is truly life-giving. God's table is set for you. God's bread is food indeed. Let God minister to your needs and strengthen you for your journey. Amen.